a famous surgeon being called a monkey in the first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight, simply because she's black. The person who said this was a seasoned pilot, a man with years of experience and accolades, trusted by the airline to oversee the lives of hundreds of passengers. But this pilot made one fatal mistake. He had no idea that the woman he had just insulted was married to the man who owned the entire airline, and her husband was sitting right next to her. What happens next isn't just about instant termination. What would you think if I told you that, in the comfort of a luxurious first-class cabin, amid the sleek elegance of a private suite, a hurtful insult was uttered so deep it could unravel a life in seconds? Before we continue following the dramatic developments ahead, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to give me motivation to keep bringing you more captivating stories. And where are you listening to this story from? Leave a comment and let me know. Now, let's return to the story. Imagine this scene. You're sitting on an opulent flight, your skin glowing under the soft lighting, the distant hum of the aircraft like a lullaby. You and your partner, built from years of sacrifice, finally have the moment to breathe. The champagne sparkles, the leather seats embrace you like a soft cocoon, and for once the outside world seems like a blur. But then, like a storm out of nowhere, it happens. In the silence of the first-class suite, Sarah Duncan, a woman who had been in countless operating rooms, who had held the fragile, broken hearts of her patients in her hands, felt a chill run through her body. There it was, the pilot's gaze, a subtle shift in his posture, and then the words that would linger in the cabin long after they were spoken. The ugly, painful words that turned the air in that suite toxic. Can't have the monkey getting scared of a few flashing lights, can we? The air went still. The lights, once gently flickering, seemed to pulse in a cruel rhythm, each strobe matching the beat of Sarah's heart. For a moment, everything else faded. The smell of leather, the taste of champagne, the hum of the engine beneath their feet. All that remained was a word that could strip away a person's dignity in an instant, a word that no one had asked for. Sarah's eyes locked with the captain's. His pale blue eyes were cold, calculating, but she could see something else there, something darker. Faction in his sneer, the way he spoke to her as if she were just an object in his airspace. But to her, she was more than that. She had built a life of strength and success, but in that moment, none of it mattered. In that moment, she was reduced to a cruel stereotype, something to be mocked, to be belittled. And this wasn't just a casual insult. It wasn't a passing comment or a careless remark. This was calculated. It came from something deep, something ingrained in the soul of a man who had never considered her his equal. This was racism, unapologetic and raw, and it would not go unchallenged. There was a pause, a heavy silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah felt her breath catch, but she didn't move. Not yet. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to retreat, to keep her head down. But no, not this time. She was more than that, and so was the man sitting across from her. Arthur Stanley, the man she met. The man who had risen from the ashes of his father's failed airline to build a thriving empire. He was the man who had protected her, loved her with quiet strength, and now, for the first time, she would see how deep his love truly ran. He didn't hesitate. His strong, sure hands set his crystal flute down. The sound of it lightly tapping the polished surface was enough to break the tension, but Sarah's heart had already leapt ahead. She looked at him. She didn't need to speak for him to understand. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had charmed their way into her life, narrowed in fury. It wasn't the rage of a man who had been insulted. No, this was something deeper, something that bubbled up from a place of protection. This was the man she knew, the man who would not stand by while another human being was reduced to nothing. Arthur didn't stand up suddenly. There was no angry flourish, no loud confrontation. He simply rose from his seat. He moved with deliberate grace, unfolding his tall frame in a way that commanded attention. The kind of attention that demanded respect, not because of brute force, but because of pure presence. And when he stepped into the aisle, walking toward Captain Finnegan Alley, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The light that had once danced on the pristine walls of the suite now seemed to focus entirely on the confrontation. It was a scene of two men, one a relic of the old world, privileged, arrogant, and powerful. The other a product of the new world, a man of purpose, integrity, and love. A man who had worked to build an empire that would change the face of luxury air travel, who had created a space where everyone was welcome. Arthur, the CEO of Orionaire, stood in front of the captain, and the passengers held their breath. Captain Finnegan Alley, Arthur's voice was a low murmur, yet it cut through the silence like a knife. "You've just insulted my wife," Alley, too stunned by the situation, stammered. "It was just a joke, Mr. Stanley. Just some toes, just some hanger talk. Just a joke." Arthur's voice dropped an octave, growing colder, growing colder. "You think reducing a brilliant woman to a racist trope is a joke? You think that's something to laugh about?" The passengers in the cabin, who had been murmuring quietly, now turned their attention fully to the confrontation. They could feel the shift in the air. They could feel the tension between the two men, the clash of their worlds. The cold, calculated dismissal of Sarah by the captain was met with Arthur's raw, unflinching fury. But it wasn't the fury of a man scorned. It was the fury of a man who would not let his wife, his partner, be torn down. "Not again. Not ever," Alley flustered, trying to salvage his position. "I've been flying for years. I'm from a different generation. Things were different back then." "Well, we're not living in that generation anymore," Arthur said, stepping closer. "And that kind of behavior isn't tolerated here. Not on my plane. Not in my company. Not in my life." Arthur turned his gaze to the crew. The silence that followed was suffocating. The words that had just been spoken were a judgment, not just on the captain's actions, but on the system that had allowed such attitudes to persist for so long. He wasn't just speaking to Captain Ali. He was speaking to the entire system that had allowed someone like him to rise to power. Sarah watched her husband with quiet, steady resolve. She felt the heat of his anger, but she also felt the warmth of his love. He was her protector. And in that moment, it wasn't just about the insult or the man who had spoken it. It was about standing up against the ugliness of the world and saying, "This will not stand." But Arthur had more to say. "I think it's time we put an end to this. Captain, I'm afraid you're done here. Your employment with Orionaire is terminated, effective immediately." The words hung in the air. The shock was palpable. Alley, still reeling, stood frozen. The passengers, the flight attendants, and even Kiana, the young flight attendant who had first approached Ali, now turned to stare. They were all witnesses to a moment that was bigger than any of them. It was a lesson that wouldn't just be learned by Captain Ali, but by everyone aboard that flight. And in that moment, as the plane continued its journey through the sky, Sarah and Arthur knew that what had just transpired would ripple out into the world far beyond the confines of the aircraft. The moments following Arthur's declaration were like the calm after a violent storm. Still, yet charged with a tension that was impossible to ignore. The first-class cabin, once filled with the quiet murmur of luxury and the low clinking of champagne glasses, now stood suspended in an uneasy. The faces of the passengers, some still hidden behind newspapers or engrossed in their digital devices, slowly turned toward the scene unfolding before them, eyes wide, as if they too were waiting for the air to shift once more. The power of Arthur's words, the sheer finality of them, resonated through the cabin, and for the first time, Finnegan Alley's once unshakable authority began to crack. Alley stood frozen in place, his mouth slightly agape, as if the words had been stolen from him. His grip on the aircraft's cold, polished interior had tightened, his knuckles now bone-white, betraying the mask of arrogance he had so carefully constructed over the years. And yet, for all his years of flying, for all the miles he had traveled in his seasoned career, nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. Not the personal affront, not the authority of the man standing before him. Certainly not the weight of the world that now seemed to rest on his shoulders. Arthur didn't flinch. He stood firm, a man who knew what he was about, and in that knowing was a quiet power. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to shout. His presence, calm but unyielding, did all the work. Every word was measured, every pause calculated. He was not just protecting his wife. He was reclaiming something far larger. He was taking back the dignity of a life built in the face of every obstacle. Sarah, sitting in her seat, felt that quiet resolve resonate within her. She had lived her life proving herself, never asking for anyone's validation, but earning it in every room she entered, in every heart she saved. This moment was just another chapter in her story, a story that would not end in the shadows of bigotry, no matter how hard the world tried to make her small. But she was not the only one who had changed. Arthur had changed too. The man who had once bent over backward to smooth the rough edges of corporate life, the man who had inherited a struggling airline and transformed it into a global icon, was now confronting a far more personal battle. He had spent his life building walls, protecting himself, protecting his empire. But now, standing in front of the very man who had crossed the line, he saw clearly that those walls had not kept the darkness at bay. It had seeped through. And as the confrontation unfolded, as his voice cracked through the tension, Arthur realized something profound. The fight for what was right could not be fought with stone walls. It had to be fought with something else, something deeper, something more human. It had to be fought with love. And love was the unspoken power behind his every action. "I want you off my plane, Allie," Arthur's voice had softened, but the words still carried the weight of an entire empire. "There is no place for you here, and no place for you in Orionaire anymore." The words hung heavy in the air like a final judgment, and in the silence that followed, the truth of them was undeniable. Allie's face, once flushed with the self-assurance of a man who believed in his own power, paled. His hands, those hands that had once held the control of a flight, trembled ever so slightly. It was a brief moment of vulnerability, a split second when the mask of arrogance slipped and the man was revealed in his rawness. But there was no sympathy to be found in that moment. The silence in the cabin was deafening, as the reality of the situation dawned on every person in that first-class suite. The pilot, once the trusted figure at the helm of the plane, was now nothing more than a man on the receiving end of his own cruelty. The shift was palpable. Captain Alley, still gripping the edges of the suite door, tried to stammer a response, but the words failed him. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again, but no coherent sentence came. Instead, he was left with a sense of defeat that crushed him far deeper than the termination of his employment. He had been reduced to a spectacle, a man who had thrown away decades of respect for the illusion of power. And now there would be no going back. Meanwhile, Sarah remained seated, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was the image of calm composure. But inside, the tempest raged. She felt a deep, familiar ache spread through her chest, the kind of ache that always lingered just beneath the surface. It was the same ache she had felt every time her worth had been questioned, every time her success had been overlooked, every time she had been reduced to something less than human by people who thought they had the right to do so. But this time it was different. This time there would be no silence. This time there would be no retreat. She had never been one to shy away from the fight, and this moment was no exception. What had been done to her in that instant would be confronted, not with a response of fury, but with one of undeniable power. It wasn't her fight alone. She had the man who had loved her, supported her, and seen her for who she truly was standing beside her. Arthur had fired the captain, but more than that, he had exposed the deep-rooted rot that festered not just in Ali, but in the very fabric of the airline's culture. It wasn't enough to punish one man. It wasn't enough to make an example of him and move on. No, this would be a turning point. The world would see that Orionaire stood for something different, that its leadership, its ethos, its very soul was grounded in something that went beyond luxury seats and gold-plated amenities. It was about the people who walked through its doors, the lives it touched, the values it upheld. The captain finally turned, his face flushed with humiliation, and walked out of the suite. His footsteps were slow, dragging behind him the weight of a career unraveling in real time. As he disappeared from sight, a strange sense of closure settled over the suite. There was no applause. There was no fanfare. Just the quiet sense that something important had just happened, that a moment so small to some would carry with it consequences far greater than anyone could imagine. For Sarah, the moment was both a victory and a reminder. She had won, yes, but there would be more battles ahead, more challenges to face. She would never be the woman who let an insult define her, but she also knew this world, her world, was not yet ready to let go of its prejudices. Not by a long shot. As the plane sailed on toward London, Sarah and Arthur sat quietly together, the storm of the moment beginning to settle in their hearts. But the air in the cabin felt lighter, and somehow, so did their hearts. The plane cruised high above the clouds, its steady hum offering a strange kind of peace, but the storm within the cabin still raged. Sarah sat quietly, her eyes unfocused, staring out of the window. The scenery below was a blur, a patchwork of blues and whites. The distant horizon stretched out before her like an unreachable dream. She could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what had just happened. It had been a confrontation, a battle of wills, but it wasn't just about the insult. No, it was much bigger than that. The word, that vile word spoken by Captain Ali, wasn't just a passing moment of hate. It was a stark reminder of the world she lived in. A world where, no matter how high she rose, no matter how many lives she saved, there would always be those who saw her as less, who saw her for the color of her skin and not the brilliance of her mind. She had dealt with it her whole life, this subtle, insidious prejudice. It was always there, lurking in the corners, waiting for its chance to strike. But today, for the first time in a long while, she felt something different. She felt seen. Not just as a woman, not just as a doctor, but as a person deserving of respect, a person who had been protected, and for that she was grateful. Arthur sat beside her, his expression unreadable. His mind was no longer in the plane, no longer focused on the luxury around them. It was back in the boardroom, back at Orionaire, back with the company he had inherited from his father. It wasn't just about firing a racist pilot. It was about the deeper work that needed to be done. The systemic issues that had festered beneath the shiny exterior of the company, hidden in the shadows of its privileged old-world culture. He had been so focused on the outward success of Orionaire, the luxury, the prestige, the accolades, that he had failed to notice the cracks in the foundation. Cracks that ran deep, cracks that had allowed men like Captain Ali to thrive. As the plane flew on, Arthur's mind raced. He had never been one to shy away from a challenge. But this was different. It wasn't just about business. It wasn't just about running a company. This was about doing the hard work of change, the real work. The work of dismantling the toxic culture that had taken root in the very place he had built. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, but it was necessary. And he was going to do it for Sarah, for the company, for every person who had ever been made to feel less than because of who they were. "I'll get to work on it tomorrow," he said softly, his voice low but determined. "I'll start with the internal review. We need to look at the entire culture of this company, from the ground up. I need to know if there are more men like Ali hidden in plain sight." Sarah turned to him, her eyes softening as she reached for his hand. "I know you will," she said quietly. "But you can't do it alone. You don't have to." He looked at her, and for a moment the weight of everything, the firing, the fallout, the investigation, seemed to lift. She was right. He didn't have to do it alone. She was his partner, in life and in this fight. And together they could change not just Orionaire, but the world around them. It wasn't about tearing things down. It was about rebuilding, about creating a new world. One where people like her, like him, like everyone, could thrive without fear of being dismissed or belittled. "I'll need help," he said, his voice steady now, his mind already formulating a plan. "A full-scale investigation. External auditors will have to dig into every corner of this company. I want to know everything. Every policy, every practice. We're going to rebuild this company's culture from the inside out." Sarah nodded. "You'll need someone who's not afraid to look at the ugliness and call it out." "I know who I'll ask," Arthur replied. He turned to her with a glint in his eyes. "Petra Craven. She's the one. She's ruthless when it comes to finding the truth." Sarah smiled, a small, knowing smile. Petra Craven was no stranger to digging into the darkest corners of a story. She had made a name for herself as an investigative journalist before moving into the corporate world, and she had a knack for uncovering things that others would rather stay hidden. If anyone could help them root out the toxicity in Orionaire, it was Petra. As the hours stretched on and the flight continued its steady journey, the couple sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire that had burned in Arthur's eyes when he had stood up to Captain Ali was still there, but now it was tempered with a sense of resolve. He had taken the first step, but there was so much more to do. The change he wanted to see in Orionaire was not going to come easily. There would be resistance. There would be pushback. But he was ready. Sarah knew what was coming. She knew the battle that lay ahead, but she also knew this, Brindal. The true power of change didn't lie in grand gestures. It didn't lie in the dramatic moments that made headlines or broke records. It lay in the quiet, everyday decisions, the ones that were made when no one was watching. It lay in the work that happened behind the scenes, in the quiet spaces where the real transformation occurred. And she was ready for that. She was ready for the long, hard journey of rebuilding, of healing, of making sure that no one, No one would ever be made to feel small again. "I'll stand by you," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Always." Arthur turned to her, his eyes softening with love and gratitude. "And I'll stand by you," he replied. No matter what, the rest of the flight passed in a blur. The noise of the outside world, the chatter of the other passengers, the hum of the engines, all of it felt distant, disconnected from the reality that Sarah and Arthur were now facing. But for the first time in a long time, that didn't matter. They had each other, and they had a mission to change not just the company they had built, but the world that they would leave behind. The journey was far from over. When the plane touched down at Heathrow, the echoes of the conflict on board still reverberated in the air. Sarah and Arthur stood side by side, stepping off the plane together, their presence a quiet declaration of unity. The ordeal had opened their eyes, each in their own way, to the truth of what they were up against. It wasn't just about one man's racist slur. It was about something far deeper, more pervasive, an entire system that still clung to old prejudices, to outdated notions of who deserved respect, who deserved power. As they walked through the terminal, the bustle of travelers around them seemed distant, as if their lives, their reality, had become something apart from the frenetic world of the airport. They were not just returning from a trip, they were stepping into the future of something larger than themselves. Sarah could feel it, the shift in the air. It was not just a sense of accomplishment, but a quiet anticipation, as though they were walking on the edge of something monumental. She felt the weight of the stairs, the whispers of the passengers who had been on the flight with them, the ones who had witnessed the exchange with Captain Ali. They had seen it unfold. They had seen how Arthur had dealt with the situation, how he had taken control with a quiet strength. She knew that the world had already begun to change because of it. Not just because of the firing, but because of how Arthur had handled it. With power, yes, but with compassion, with dignity, with integrity. They moved swiftly through the terminal, their minds already set on what lay ahead. They had no time for the questions or the looks. The investigation had already begun in their minds. Arthur knew it was time to get to work. There were deeper issues to confront, cracks in the walls that needed to be addressed before they could ever think of moving forward. The airline, Orionaire, was more than a business to him. It was his legacy, and it was one he would fight to protect, one he would rebuild. Their car awaited them at the tarmac. The drive to the hotel was quiet, but both of them were thinking of the next steps. Arthur had already begun outlining the investigation in his head. He knew where to start. Petra Craven. She would be the key. And beyond her, a full review of every employee, every department, every corner of the company that had been allowed to fester with resentment, with outdated attitudes. "Tomorrow," Arthur began, his voice low and steady, "I'm calling for a full-scale internal audit. Not just the diversity programs, but everything. We need to look at the structure, the leadership, the culture. If there are more men like Ali, if there are more people like Justin Craven lurking in the shadows, we need to find them." Sarah looked out the window, the lights of London sweeping past in a blur. She could hear the quiet determination in his voice, and it brought her a sense of peace. This wasn't just about making a point. This wasn't just about a single confrontation with a pilot. This was about building something better, something stronger, something that would stand for the future, not the past. "I'll be there every step of the way," she said softly. Her voice was steady, resolute. "I don't want to just watch this change happen. I want to be part of it. I want to make sure it's real." Arthur glanced at her, his face softening with a smile. "I know you do, Sifi. I know you will. We'll rebuild this together." But the road ahead wasn't going to be smooth. The first signs of resistance began to show almost immediately. By the time they settled into their hotel suite, the media had already gotten a hold of the story. It was everywhere. Racist pilot fired mid-flight by CEO, the headlines screamed. It wasn't just a story of a racist outburst. It was a story of a company taking a stand, of a powerful CEO making a bold decision that would change everything. The public reaction was swift. Some praised Arthur for his actions, while others criticized him for making such a spectacle out of what they deemed a personal matter. Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The media would focus on the drama of it, on the sensationalism of a firing in mid-air. But that wasn't the point. The point was what came next. The real work would be done behind closed doors, in the offices and boardrooms, where the culture of Orionaire would either be dismantled or left to fester. She was ready for that. She had no time for the noise of the outside world. The work needed to be done, and it would be done by those who truly cared about making a change. The following morning, as Sarah prepared for her keynote speech at the World Health Innovators Summit in London, Arthur made his call to Petra Craven. She was already gathering her team, preparing for the deep dive into the company's inner workings. It would take time. There was no quick fix to this, but Petra was the right person. She had no patience for corporate doublespeak, no tolerance for those who hid behind their titles. She was going to get to the heart of the issue, no matter how deep it ran. "I've got my team lined up," Petra said when Arthur called her. "We'll start with the pilot's files, of course, but we're going to need more than that. I want access to everything: employee surveys, internal communications, even the old policies you're still holding on to. If there's something that's been swept under the rug, I'll find it." Arthur leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day beginning to settle on him. He knew Petra would get results. She always did. But it was more than just finding out what had happened with Ali. It was about discovering how much of this culture had infected Orionaire from the top down. "I'll have my people gather everything you need," he said. "We're starting this now. No more waiting." In the meantime, Sarah stepped into the spotlight. She had always been a woman of action, but now, with the summit on the horizon, she was stepping into a new role, a role that went beyond medicine, beyond surgery. She was now a symbol, not just of success, but of strength, and she would not let anyone forget. The summit was a success. Her speech was met with a standing ovation. It was the culmination of years of hard work, of struggles, and of triumphs. Sarah had earned her place at the top. But even as the applause filled the room, even as she took in the admiration of the crowd, she knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't just speaking about the future of cardiac surgery. She was speaking about the future of a company that had been built on the promise of inclusivity, of respect, a company that had just begun to reckon with its past. And as the applause died down and Sarah made her way off the stage, she felt a quiet strength settle in her chest. She wasn't just changing the world of medicine, she was changing the world of business, one decision at a time. The evening after the summit, the weight of the day settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy cloak. The accolades had come, the applause had echoed, but in the silence of the hotel suite, where the city lights below shimmered like stars in a dark sky, she felt the enormity of the work still to be done. Arthur, beside her, was quieter than usual. His mind wasn't with her, wasn't in the quiet luxury of the suite they'd rented for the night. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the company, on the changes that were already in motion. Sarah turned to him, a sense of understanding settling between them. "You're thinking about the next step, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but unwavering. There was no need for more words. She knew him too well, and at this moment, He was still holding the weight of the world in his hands, just as he had done when he first inherited Orionaire. But now the weight was different. It wasn't about profit margins or expansion. It was about something deeper. It was about integrity, about righting the wrongs that had been allowed to thrive beneath the polished surface of success. Arthur met her gaze, his eyes tired but resolute. "There's more to do," he said, his voice low. "The investigation into Ollie is only the beginning. I've got a whole team ready to dig deeper. This culture, it's not just about the pilots or the board members like Craven. It's ingrained in the way we operate, in the way we look at people, treat people. We've built a company around luxury, around power, around a status quo that's been unchallenged for too long. But now it's time to change everything." Sarah nodded, her eyes steady with conviction. She understood his urgency. She had seen the corruption of that world up close, and now they both had to face it together. She reached out, her hand finding his, the warmth of her touch grounding him in the stillness of the moment. She was his partner in every sense of the word, not just in love, but in this battle. She would not let him fight this alone. "You don't have to do it all by yourself, Alex," she said quietly. "I'm here. We're here. Together." His fingers tightened around hers, and for a moment the weight seemed a little lighter, the road ahead a little clearer. But that was the quiet strength they had built, the foundation that had carried them through countless trials. And now it would carry them through this. The next morning the world continued to turn, and with it the wheels of the investigation. Petra Craven was already in full swing, assembling the documents, the files, the evidence. She was relentless, her team of investigators delving into every crevice of the company's operations. Every complaint, every questionable policy, every whisper of discontent among the staff was being gathered, scrutinized, and analyzed. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly beginning to come together. It wasn't just a few rogue employees. It wasn't just Captain Ali or even Justin Craven. It was something much larger, a network of men, of systems, of entrenched ideologies that had festered for years, hidden beneath the glossy exterior of Orionaire. Sarah could feel it too. It was a sickness, one that had taken root in the very heart of the company. But it was a sickness that would be exposed, and when it was, there would be no place for it to hide, not anymore. Meanwhile, Arthur had already begun making changes. It wasn't just about firing employees or removing toxic figures from positions of power. That was the easy part. The real work was in reshaping the culture. It was in rebuilding trust, creating a company that valued integrity, respect, and fairness above everything else. The changes would be slow, methodical, but they would be transformative. He sat at his desk in the sprawling office, staring out the window at the city below. The weight of the decision he had made to uproot the system that had been in place for decades still felt monumental. He had spent years building his father's company into a symbol of power and luxury. But now it was time to build something new, something better. He turned to Sarah, who had come in to join him, her presence like a steadying force in the storm of his thoughts. "I'm changing everything," he said quietly. "I'm starting with the senior management. It's time to overhaul the leadership. If we're going to change the culture, we need new blood. People who believe in what we're doing, in the future we're building. I won't let people like Craven and Ali poison this company any longer." Sarah's gaze softened, her heart swelling with pride for him. "And what about the employees?" she asked. "The ones who've been here, who've been part of the old culture, the ones who were too afraid to speak out?" "They'll be heard," he replied firmly. "We'll have anonymous reporting channels, regular feedback loops." We're creating an environment where people can speak up without fear of retribution. I want the people who work for us to feel safe, valued. I want them to know that their voice matters." Sarah smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. This was the man she had fallen in love with, the man who saw beyond the surface, who understood that true leadership was not about wielding power, but about using it to create change. Real change. It was going to be a long journey, one that would require patience and persistence. But Sarah knew that with Arthur leading the charge, and with her by his side, they would build a new Orionaire, one that would stand as a beacon of inclusivity, respect, and fairness. And so they began one step at a time. The wheels of change were in motion, and there was no turning back. The ghosts of the past were being confronted, and slowly the future began to take shape. It was a future of hope, of possibility, a future where the lessons of the past would not be forgotten, but would guide them forward. For Sarah, for Arthur, and for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, this was just the beginning. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind, frenetic, urgent, yet somehow methodical. The changes that Arthur and Sarah had set into motion were already stirring ripples through the company. Peter Craven's investigation was a meticulous operation, uncovering layer upon layer of discontent, of quiet revolts that had festered beneath the shiny surface of the airline's success. And with each new piece of evidence, Arthur's resolve grew stronger. The cracks in the facade were undeniable, but it was in these cracks that the possibility for real transformation lay. He had always been a man who could see a business opportunity from a mile away, but this was different. This was not about profit margins or expanding the fleet. It was about something deeper, about people, about trust, about the kind of culture he wanted to foster at Orionaire. And every day, as more came to light, Arthur could see how much work lay ahead. He wasn't just rebuilding an airline, he was dismantling an entire system, one that had been built on a foundation of exclusion and privilege, one that had, for too long, ignored the voices of those who had been marginalized. The first round of changes came swiftly. New executives were brought in, fresh faces, eager to prove themselves, who understood the direction Arthur wanted to take. But even more important were the grassroots changes, the new diversity and inclusion programs, the anonymous channels for employee feedback, the open-door policies that allowed the voices of the often silenced to be heard. Yet, despite all the changes, there were those who resisted. The old guard, those who had been comfortable in the company's old world, felt threatened by what Arthur was doing. They were unwilling to let go of the power they had so long enjoyed. And in their refusal to change, they revealed their true faces. The resistance was subtle at first, discreet comments in the hallways, the quiet discontent in meetings, but it didn't take long, for Arthur to see the full extent of the pushback. The board members who had remained from his father's era, men like Justin Craven, were vocal in their disdain for the changes. Their objections were veiled behind corporate jargon, their disdain masked in polite suggestions to slow down or take a more measured approach. But it was clear to Arthur that their resistance wasn't about careful planning or strategy. It was about power, about preserving the world they had known, a world of privilege that had been threatened by his vision for a more inclusive future. Arthur knew this battle would not be won overnight. These were deeply rooted beliefs, held by men and women who had spent decades building their lives on a system of exclusion. But he was prepared to face them, to challenge them at every turn. And he wasn't going to back down, not now. Not after everything he had worked for and not after everything Sarah had endured. Sarah, for her part, had thrown herself into the process with a quiet yet unrelenting determination. Her work at the summit had been the first step in a much larger journey, one that would require not just her voice but her actions. She had always been a surgeon, focused on healing what was broken, but now she was seeing the same opportunity for healing in a corporate context. The company was broken. The culture needed surgery, open-heart surgery, and she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. She had seen the toll the past few weeks had taken on Arthur. The stress was evident in the deep lines that had begun to form around his eyes, in the subtle tension of his shoulders as he sat at the head of the table during board meetings. She knew the burden he was carrying, the weight of the decisions he was making, the decisions that would shape the future of Orionaire for years to come. But she also knew he was the right man for the job. He had the vision, the strength, and the courage to face this challenge head-on, and with her by his side, he would not fail. One afternoon, as the investigation into Ali and the culture at Orionaire deepened, Sarah sat with Petra in a small, quiet meeting room at the corporate headquarters. The air was thick with the scent of freshly printed documents and the faint hum of office machinery. Petra had just finished reviewing the latest round of interviews with employees, and the findings were unsettling. "There's more," Petra said, her voice low, almost apologetic. "I've spoken to several employees, mostly lower-level staff, and the culture of prejudice and discrimination goes beyond just the pilots. It's systemic, and it's not just about race, it's about gender, too. There's a very real divide in how women are treated here, especially in senior management positions." Sarah felt her heart tighten in her chest. She had expected to find some evidence of racial prejudice, but this was worse. This was the kind of systemic discrimination that couldn't be fixed with just a few policy changes. It was ingrained, deeply rooted in the company's foundation. "What do you suggest?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. Petra leaned forward, her eyes intense. "We need to dig deeper. We need to uncover not just the policies, but the people behind them, the decision-makers, the ones who have been fostering this toxic culture. This isn't just about one or two bad apples. It's about a whole orchard." Sarah nodded slowly. She could feel the weight of the truth in Petra's words. The battle they were fighting was not just with the individuals who had caused harm. It was with an entire system that had allowed them to thrive. She knew they had no choice but to continue. But she also knew that the path ahead would be fraught with difficulty. It was one thing to confront a single act of racism, a single slur spoken by a man who had no idea who she truly was. It was another thing entirely to face the ugliness that had been woven into the very fabric of Orionaire. She looked at Petra, her expression hardening with resolve. "We do whatever it takes," she said firmly. "We expose it all, no matter where it leads." Petra's lips curled into a small smile, a look of approval passing between them. They were in this together, and together they would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. Back at the hotel, Arthur sat in his suite, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. He had just received the latest report from Petra. It was worse than he had imagined. The resistance was stronger, more entrenched than he had thought. The old guard was not going to go down quietly. They would fight him at every turn, but he was ready for it. He had to be. This wasn't just about preserving his legacy. It was about something far more important. It was about righting the wrongs of the past, about creating a company that would stand for more than just luxury. It was about creating a company that could be proud of the people it employed, no matter their race, their gender, or their background. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, breaking his reverie. She had entered the room quietly, her presence grounding him as always, about how we handle the next step. This isn't just a company problem anymore. It's a societal problem, a systemic one. Arthur turned to her, his gaze steady. "You're right. This is bigger than us, bigger than Orionaire." Sarah sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the city outside. But we're the ones who have to make the change. We can't keep looking the other way." And with those words, Arthur knew that they were both on the same path. It was a path that would not be easy, but it was the only path worth walking. The weight of the decision loomed like a storm on the horizon. Arthur and Sarah had made their choice, and now there was no turning back. The wheels of change were grinding forward, and with each passing day, the enormity of what they were attempting to do grew clearer. The road ahead was filled with obstacles, resistance, and undoubtedly backlash. But in those quiet moments before the storm broke, there was a calm certainty between them. They had crossed a threshold. They had decided to challenge not just the men who had made the world harder for Sarah, but the very culture that allowed such men to thrive. The investigation into Orionaire's culture was proving to be far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Petra Craven and her team had uncovered a series of unsettling truths. It wasn't just the men in the cockpit, the pilots who felt the sting of time's aging prejudices. It wasn't just the shadowy figures lurking in the boardroom, like Justin Craven, who'd tried to bury change beneath a cloud of corporate jargon. No, the deeper Petra dug, the more she found that the rot went far beyond just a few bad apples. It was in the very policies that had been put in place over the years, and in the very minds of those who had crafted them. But that was exactly why Sarah had agreed to help Arthur. She understood the stakes. She had known for so long that the world wasn't just going to change for her. It was going to change because of people like her. People who had been ignored, who had been made to feel less than. It was going to be a fight, and it was a fight that would shape not just the company they had worked to build, but the world they would leave behind. But first, there had to be transparency. The truth had to be aired, no matter how ugly. And Arthur knew that as he faced the growing backlash, he had to be prepared. "We're moving too fast," one of the board members, a senior figure who had been with the company for decades, said one morning in a meeting. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried the subtle edge of fear of change. Fear of losing the power they had all held for so long too fast? Arthur echoed, his voice steady. "I'm not moving fast enough. If you can't see that, then you're part of the problem." The room went quiet. There was no noise from the usual shuffle of papers or tapping of pens, just silence. And in that silence it became clear who was with him and who wasn't. "You're talking about dismantling everything," another board member, a woman who had once been a close confidant of Arthur's father, spoke up. "The legacy of Orionaire? What about the shareholders, the investors, the brand? You can't risk it all on." "This isn't about risking the brand," Arthur replied, his voice cutting through the tension. "This is about saving it. You're so worried about the image, but we've built a house of cards. If we don't change this, if we don't root out the prejudices that have become so ingrained in our company, it'll all come crashing down." The resistance was there, hidden in plain sight. It wasn't just about the men like Ali or Craven who had openly displayed their bigotry. It was in the silent whispers of board members, in the behind-the-scenes maneuvering, in the deep-set fear of change. The ones who had benefited from the status quo didn't want to see it crumble. They wanted to keep their positions, their power, their control. They didn't care about the real work that had to be done. They cared about their own security, about keeping things just as they were, but it wasn't easy. There were setbacks. There were long nights spent with lawyers, trying to protect their decisions in a way that wouldn't draw too much attention from the media. There were meetings with human resources, trying to figure out how to implement the changes without losing the support of the older, more established. There were objections from the senior staff, from those who had long enjoyed the advantages granted to them by the old system. The new policies weren't always popular. The new way of doing things wasn't always smooth. But for every setback there was a victory, small at first, a new hire, a new program, a department that was finally, slowly, opening its eyes to the possibility of something different. And every small victory felt like a piece of the larger puzzle finally falling into place. And through it all, Sarah stood by Arthur's side, her voice steady, her resolve unwavering. She was not just the wife of the CEO anymore. She was the face of the change. She was the one who had seen the ugliness, the prejudice, and the hate. She was the one who had fought for her place at the table. And now she was helping to build something that would allow others to do the same. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the towering skyline of New York, Arthur sat on the balcony of their penthouse, looking out at the city. Sarah joined him, her presence a quiet force behind him. They stood there for a long time, in silence, watching as the city below moved in its rhythm. As it always did. The traffic, the people, the sounds, the chaos of the world continued, and yet they stood still. Together. "We're not done," Arthur said quietly, almost to himself, "but we've made a start." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "One step at a time," she said, her voice calm but filled with the weight of truth. One step at a time, the battle for Orionaire's soul was far from over. There would be more obstacles, more resistance, but in that moment, with the city stretched out before them, Sarah and Arthur knew that they had started something important, something that could change not just their company, but the world. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy balance. The storm that had shaken Orionaire was not over, but its winds had slowed, its power dwindling. The investigation continued, its tendrils reaching deeper into the company's foundation, unearthing stories of quiet suffering, of systemic bias that had become so ingrained, so accepted, that it was practically invisible to those who weren't looking. But now, with Arthur at the helm, there was no turning back. He had promised a reckoning, and he was delivering piece by piece. Sarah, too, was deep into her work. The public face of the company's transformation, she had become the focal point of the new initiatives, the embodiment of the change they were trying to create. As the weeks passed, the media, once quick to sensationalize the firing of Captain Ali, shifted their focus. No longer was it about a moment of outrage in the sky. Now, it was about the larger picture. It was about the cultural overhaul that was taking root. It was about the promise that Arthur and Sarah had made, that Orionaire would stand as a beacon of inclusivity, of respect, and of unwavering commitment to change. But despite the progress, there were those who continued to resist. It wasn't just the old guard, the ones who had been entrenched in the company for decades, who fought against the tide. It was the more subtle forms of resistance, the dismissive remarks, the covert undermining, the quiet reluctance to fully embrace the new culture. It was the daily grind of shifting attitudes, the battle for hearts and minds, and Sarah knew that the work she and Arthur were doing was not a quick fix. It was a slow, deliberate transformation. One afternoon, as she sat in a meeting with the newly formed Ethics and Diversity Council, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility they were shouldering. She had seen the worst of the world in the operating room, the fractured hearts, the broken bodies, But this was different. This was about rebuilding something from the inside out. It was about repairing a broken culture, a task that was far more complex than any surgery she had ever performed. Petra Craven, ever the diligent investigator, had been relentless in her pursuit of the truth. The findings were eye-opening. There had been whispers among the pilots, the flight attendants, even the ground staff. The stories they told were ones of quiet resistance, of subtle microaggressions that had been allowed to go unchecked for years. But it wasn't just the employees. It was the way the system had been built to protect the old power structures, to give those at the top the ability to control, to decide who belonged and who didn't. It had been a system that had allowed racism, sexism, and prejudice to flourish under the guise of corporate efficiency. Sarah knew they were making progress. She could feel it in the air. But there were times when the burden of it all seemed too heavy to carry. It wasn't just the fight against the prejudices of others. It was the fight within herself. The fight to stay hopeful, to stay resilient when every day brought a new challenge, a new revelation about how deep the rot ran. "Is it enough?" she asked one night as she sat with Arthur in their penthouse, the city lights flickering below. She had asked herself this question over and over again in the weeks since the changes had begun. Are we really making the difference we promised? Or is this all just a band-aid on a wound that runs too deep? Arthur's gaze was steady, his hand resting on hers, a silent promise that he was in this with her. "It's enough because we're doing it. We're not just talking about change, Sifi. We're making it happen. It won't be quick, it won't be easy, but this is just the beginning. We're going to keep pushing, we're going to keep digging, and slowly we'll rebuild." The next few days were filled with more meetings, more strategy sessions, more difficult conversations with executives who were still unsure about the new direction. The tension was palpable, but every step forward was a victory, no matter how small. Petra continued her work, uncovering the final pieces of the puzzle, and soon enough, the full scale of the conspiracy began to come into focus. The network that had allowed men like Justin Craven to thrive was far deeper than anyone had imagined. But as the investigation reached its climax, as the final pieces were put into place, Arthur found himself growing more and more exhausted. The pressure of it all was beginning to take its toll. The constant barrage of resistance, the long hours, the never-ending scrutiny. It was draining. Sarah could see it in his eyes, the weariness that had settled in his bones, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of the responsibility. One evening, as they sat in their suite, Sarah took a deep breath and placed her hand on his arm. "You don't have to carry this alone, Alex," she said softly. "We're in this together. You've done more in these past few weeks than most people do in a lifetime. But you can't fight this battle by yourself." Arthur turned to her, his face softened by the quiet understanding in her words. "I know. But it feels like it's all on my shoulders, you know? Every decision, every change. It's all up to me," Sarah smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "You've got me. You've got Petra. You've got the whole team behind you. But more than that, you've got your vision. And that's something no one can take away." Arthur took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling on him. She was right. He didn't have to fight this battle alone. And even though the road ahead was still long, even though the work would never truly be finished, he knew that together they could keep pushing forward. Together they could keep building. The next morning, the company took its next big step. Arthur called an emergency meeting with the board. The time had come, the time to act. They couldn't waste any more time fighting the old guard. They needed to break from the past completely and create a new future, one where respect and inclusivity weren't just policies, but the very fabric of the company. Sarah stood with him, side by side. This wasn't just his fight, it was hers too. She was no longer just the wife of the CEO. She was the force behind the change, the one who had walked the path of prejudice and emerged stronger for it. And together they would bring that strength to the world. "I'm going to take this company in a new direction," Arthur said, his voice steady, filled with purpose. "A direction where everyone, no matter their race, their gender, or their background, has an equal shot. We're going to rebuild from the inside out. And we're not stopping until we've made this company something we can all be proud of." The board members shifted in their seats, their expressions a mix of disbelief and reluctant acknowledgment. Some remained silent, others exchanged uncertain glances. But in the quiet of that room, one thing was clear. The future of Orionaire had changed forever. Sarah and Arthur's fight was far from over. But with each passing day, they were closer to the world they had dreamed of. A world where power, respect, and humanity were not just ideals, but the foundation on which everything else stood. And as the door closed on yet another chapter of their journey, Sarah felt something deep in her chest, a quiet sense of peace. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was for sure, it was theirs to create. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud. And don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.